In a previous video about Castel Sant'Angelo, we mentioned the Basilica of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere as a fairly interesting example to understand the history of Rome's urban development. One of the things that makes Rome so remarkable is that if you know where to look, there are many places in which it's really possible to see thousands of years of history unravel before your eyes, like a line connecting us to the people living in the same place a very long time ago. This is often possible not only in the location of big, important monuments such as the Colosseum, imperial forums, or the Vatican. Sometimes, you really just have to dig into the ground in historic parts of the city to literally peel the centuries away, finding right in front of yourself the different layers of its history, from ancient times all the way to us, right now. Without a shadow of doubt, this is one of such places. Let's start from the neighborhood, Trastevere. You are here on the western side of the river Tiber. As mentioned in the video about Castel Sant'Angelo, this place was not yet urbanized during Republican times. It is a little bit hard to imagine nowadays, but when Rome was fighting its wars against Carthage, in the area you would have found orchards, fields, and very poor buildings belonging to fishermen and farmers. The reason why nothing was built here in ancient times is simple. On the northern side of the river were the Etruscans, an hostile people, which caused no little issues and wars in the very first centuries of the history of the city. On the eastern side of the river instead, there were the Latins, with which the Romans did not only share a common language, but also a common origin. It is only natural, therefore, to understand why upon its foundation, the river represented, yes, a form of transport aiding the growth of the city. But first and foremost, it represented a border, a barrier, a natural line of defense dividing two wards, the Latin and the Etruscan one. Centuries passed, and by the decades around which Jesus Christ was born, Etruscans were already a distant memory. Nobles were the first to understand the value of this strip of land and its dual soul. On the one hand, so close to the city, its forums, temples and monuments, while however on the other hand, by all means, representing a quiet, peaceful spot in the green outside of the city. As Rome urbanized and outgrew its own borders, with a phenomenon exactly like our modern-day gentrification, many of the most important and rich Romans started to buy land and build properties in what is now the neighborhood of Trastevere. It is here, for example, that Caesar had bought a small farm, which then, with time, was converted in an actual small palace. It is also here that, for example, the brother-in-law of Emperor Augustus, Agrippa, or Claudia, the infamous lesbian of Catullo, built their houses, testifying to the increased popularity of the area towards the end of the Republican times. By the time of the Principate of Augustus, the neighborhood was already fully included in the official list of municipalities in which the city was subdivided, and towards the 2nd-1st century AD, the increasing pressure put into the historic center of the city forced people to start living more and more often on this side of the river, where at the beginning there were mostly fields and farms, substituted then by villas and rich people's homes. As the Roman Empire reached the end of its life, also thanks to the proximity to the Vatican, Trastevere sprawled into the neighborhood which we see today. Up until just a couple of decades ago, it is here where most likely you would have lived being a Roman, where the most average, everyday Romans used to live. It is in this context that the story of the Basilica of Santa Cecilia takes place. Even though looking from outside you would just see the walls and the courtyard of a church like others in the city, there is actually more than what meets the eye. The story of this place is obviously related to Saint Cecilia, the martyr to which it is consecrated. According to the chronicles, she lived in the 3rd century AD and was the daughter of one of Rome's very important families, the Ceciliae, to which belonged over the centuries many among tribunes, consuls, and even Vestal virgins. Converted to Christianity, she married a young pagan by the name of Valerianus. Instructed by the Holy Spirit, she sent her husband to Via Appia, and there, among the tombs and catacombs of early Christians, Valerianus himself had a vision of the Holy Spirit. It is then, right in that moment, that near the catacombs he would have met the then Pope Urbanus I. While it might sound strange for us to randomly meet a pope on the road, we must remember the situation of the time, in which Christians represented a fringe minority of society, far from the earthly splendor of the centuries to come. Following the experience, Valerianus also converted to Christianity, and together with his wife, convinced his brother Tiburtius as well to convert. The times in which the family lived, however, were quite troublesome and dangerous, and it is exactly then, and under the principate of Alexander Severus, the then prefect of the Eternal City, Turcius Almachius, started to persecute Christians. Like many other Christians, Valerianus was brought together with his brother to the fields, and asked to pay homage to the statues of the old pagan divinities. Following his refusal, and his testimony of loyalty to Christ, he suffered death by decapitation. Cecilia, now left widowed, was brought in front of the prefect Turcius. Like her husband, she also refused to relinquish her faith and devotion, and bothered by this display of defiance, the prefect sentenced her also to die. The sentence was to be carried out in her own house, in which she was supposed to be suffocated in the bath. The chronicles tell us, however, of how, no matter how much the executioner tried to end her life, she always managed to survive, and how, frustrated by this, he finally decided to decapitate her like her husband. Despite this, several blows to the neck were not sufficient to kill her. It is only after days of suffering that she would finally die, in which she would not end praying to God with her voice and in her heart, exalting Him and singing, action which would have later granted her to be the saint patron of musicians among the Catholic Church. Her house, which was the theatre of her execution and final death, was to be passed on to her legal heir. The sole heir of the property she designated, however, was to be Pope Urbanus himself, who survived the persecutions, to whom she asked to use the home in order to devote it to God. It is here that the story of the basilica starts, upon the ancient home of the noble family of the Ceciliae, situated on the western side of the river Tiber, where among the others, so many nobles and emperors used to live their life. The church and the altar dedicated to the saint and martyr was already well renowned through the Middle Ages, when the neighborhood was growing and sprawling out in its final form we know today. As the centuries passed, the poor and humble state of conservation of the original house, which was by then decaying, prompted a decision in the Vatican's authorities. In the 9th century AD, Pope Pasquale decided to build a big basilica, in which to bring relics of several other Roman martyrs as well, to rest together with Saint Cecilia. It is precisely here that your tour nowadays would start, in the courtyard of the basilica, attached to which there is also a monastery dedicated to Cecilia herself and Saint Agatha, another martyr with a very similar story. Entering the basilica nowadays, very little is like at the time of its construction. For the most part, it is the result of works of embellishment in the 18th century. What is worth mentioning, however, is the apsis, which still presents the original mosaic from the times of Pope Pasquale in the 9th century. Also, there is here an extremely beautiful statue representing the body of Saint. According to the story, the body of the saint was translated into another place, and in the process her tomb was opened. Upon doing so, the people present were shocked to notice how after almost 1,500 years, the body was still intact and uncorrupted. What is really interesting and remarkable, however, is also that upon request, it is possible to visit below the level of the ground, literally traveling back in time and finding the remains of the city from 2,000 years ago, testifying the story of the life of the saint, the house, but also the story of the city itself. As soon as you get down, what you are presented with are the ruins of the old domus, which also borders and includes the ruins of an apartment complex for common people, in Insula. Making your way into the perimeter, the rooms of the two distinct complexes coexist, giving life to different areas which were the object of different activities. For example, to the right, there is one big room with 8 silos dug into the ground, which were used to store different types of perishable goods, such as wheat. This room testifies the original character of the domus, as a home in the fields right next to the Eternal City, producing different sorts of produce, and most likely, being also the theatre of different sorts of economic activities, such as pelting. Making way towards the end of the underground facilities, however, you are presented with the real jewel of the entire basilica. In fact, 6 meters below the ground, it is housed the crypt in which the urn of Saint Cecilia is contained. Built at the beginning of the 20th century, in renovation of the older crypt, it stands as eternal tribute and devotion to the life of the saint, her martyrdom, testifying to her faith and her unshakable devotion to Christ.